computer. All right. And just as a backup, I'm going to turn on the tape recorder on my phone.
Same thing I do. You can never trust digital stuff.
Right. And I'm also going to take notes. All right, so listen, so for the benefit of the YouTube audience, the Zoom audience, for the benefit of you watching this conversation, I, Greg Moore of the Arizona Republic and USA Today Network, am speaking with the incomparable Cecelia Watson, author of Semicolon, The Past, Present, and Future of a Misunderstood Mark. She's a legitimate genius, like she gets paid to be smart. Whitney's Humanities Center at Yale, American Council on Learned Societies, new faculty fellowship, IFK Vienna Research Fellow, Fishbein. Currently, she is a scholar in residence at Bard College. Where you at? You in London? You in
Well, right now I'm on leave from Bard, so I'm hoping post-COVID to get back and start teaching again soon. Now that things seem to be calming down a little bit in terms of travel bans and all of that. So,
So you're saying they
um,
like American punctuation in Germany? Is that what we're learning now? Is it?
something like that. I can't even keep track of where I am most days. But yeah, London is mostly where I write. And then
Okay.
when I'm back in New York, I do my teaching bit. So
But see, I
helps
thought
to
Bard was
keep
in
both
Berlin.
up.
Is Bard not in Berlin?
There is a Bard in Berlin, and my CV is extra confusing because I am a scholar in residence, but on leave, so not in residence right now, at Bard in upstate New York. But there is also a Bard College Berlin. Bard has done a really interesting project of kind of going to various places around the world and either introducing or helping move forward liberal arts institutes in those countries. So there's a Bard in Palestine as well, for instance. There's one in Kyrgyzstan. So it's a pretty broad ranging program, and I've worked for the Berlin one as well.
All right. So look, let's just talk about your work right now. You say you're in London writing. Is this what are you working on these days?
I am. I actually just sold my second book, or I should say, my brilliant literary agent sold my second book to Riverhead, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And it is, of all the bizarre topics, about watch collecting in the Swiss watch industry. And I know that sounds like about as far as you can get from language and grammar and social structures and ethics and all of the things that I care about that I wrote about in my first book on the semicolon. It's actually surprising the overlaps between the two projects. So it's fun that you asked me to think back to that first book because it really made me aware of how much I'm still thinking about it in writing this new one.
So the first book, Semicolon, which I guess came out in I guess late 2019, somewhere in there, it struck me. I'm a former copy editor, and one of the ways to make sure that you are employed as a copy editor is to be a stickler for these old school grammar rules, right? Spelling,
Mhm.
punctuation, use, these kinds of things. That means you spend an inordinate amount of time reading, I don't know, Strunk and White, the AP style book, the Chicago style man. And what you find is that there are these distinctions. And what really struck me though is I've got a diverse background. I grew up in Detroit, but I also grew up in Granger, Indiana. I also lived in the deep South in suburban Atlanta. And what happens is you develop an ear for how people talk and how people use language. And what you recognize is that the distinction of what is quote unquote right depends on who you're speaking with and when. And I think that you really explored that. Can you tell me how you got into studying the book and how you ended up drawing some of the conclusions that you drew?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Um, your past as a copy editor, even now, I feel a sort of like little thrill of envy because even though rule books to me now are something that are interesting to study, or in this case, I'll show you what's holding up my laptop right now. Chicago Manual of Style, very useful for Zoom calls. Um, There is something so satisfying and wonderful about digging into language and the minutiae of it in the way that you do if you're doing copy editing, or if you're like I was growing up and you're just really into words and language. Um, and I suppose it was on my mind from an early age. Like you, I spent some time in the Deep South. I grew up in Tennessee and Memphis. And I learned pretty quickly when I went to college in Maryland, which, despite being below the Mason-Dixon, is not really the Deep South in any way, shape, or form. I learned that people made all kinds of judgments about me based on my accent or the kinds of word choices that I would use, just the way that I said certain things. And the assumption was that I wasn't very smart. And my reaction to that initially was try to kind of wipe out a lot of that sort of language that I grew up with and really enjoyed speaking with my parents and grandparents. And a little later on in my academic career, I finally had the sense to ask, wait a second, is that the reaction that I should have? Were those people right? And that question was occurring to me at the same time as I was having an argument with one of my supervisors about where to put a semicolon and when. And I went and looked in a whole bunch of grammar books, like the one this laptop is sitting on, searching for the answer. And what I found was that the books disagreed. And that made me wonder, wait a second, if these books disagree, then where are these rules coming from? And how would we even tell if one was right? And it had taken me all that time till I was, I think, 24, 25, something like that, for the thought to even occur to me that someone wrote these rules. They didn't fall out of the heavens. They're not just built into English. They're decisions about structure, and they must come from somewhere. So I went digging into old grammar books to figure out where they did come from. And it was so surprising to me to find, first of all, that the idea of grammar rules, it's recent and young comparatively, certainly compared to English. Grammar rules as we know them, there's not even really a glimmer of them until shortly after 1800, and they don't really become this institution that we know them as now until the 1850s and onwards. And even then there was a lot of criticism about them, because people were quite rightly saying, who are these people coming out of nowhere calling themselves grammarians, which wasn't even a profession at the time, and writing these huge books of rules telling us what to do with words? Where did they get the authority? And these guys were making a fortune off of it. So there was a huge appetite for the books, because even though people were saying, wait a second, we've not had these rules before, what are you doing? Public education was taking off at the time. So a whole bunch of people who would never have had access to schooling before suddenly did, which is great. They needed books to teach people with, and that's where grammarians saw job opportunity. And what they saw too was that what was really popular with parents was teaching kids science stuff. So not entirely different from what I've observed nowadays, where the humanities and social sciences are always kind of saying, wait a minute, we are relevant ways of understanding the world we contribute to, and parents are saying, oh, how about med school or physics? Back then, same sort of story. So what grammarians were doing when they wrote all of those rules was explicitly imitating the language and the structure of books on things like geology and geography and mathematics. And that's where we get things like sentence diagramming, which you might, like me, be old enough to remember back in school.
Oh, yeah.
They're all just supposed to be basically geometry theorems, but sentences are forced into them. So this kind of very natural, living, evolving, constantly different thing, which is English, got compressed into these rules that were meant to keep it static, immobile. And if we think of it in good terms, it was meant to make English learnable and understandable and a good way to communicate. But that has not been the effect that rules have had for the most part, at least as I've observed it. They've typically been agents of confusion, sometimes means by which we judge other people for the wrong reasons. They're gatekeeping structures in a lot of ways. And it's very hard, it's certainly very hard for me to break that habit that I began at a very young age of just assuming there was a right way to do things. And also of always reaching for the easy thing to argue with someone with, which is you got a word wrong or you put a period in the wrong place, so you must not be very smart. Nonsense.
It seems to me I remember a section in Semicolon that suggested that the punctuation may have evolved just because of typeface at the time. The typeface was just a little odd. Am I remembering that right?
Well, typefaces have a lot to do with where we get punctuation marks. So at the time when printed books started to appear, because that was such a new technology, people who were reading books, which was not a large portion of the population at the time,
Right.
they were used to transcribing books by hand, for instance, to circulate them. And they were certainly used to writing in books that were often handwritten at that time. So they did the same thing with typefaces. And what they would do is invent little marks to make sentences easier to read. So scribes and readers were actually going through and inserting marks, and then that was getting back to the printers who said, hey, this sounds like a good idea. Let's try some more of these out. And some of them have stuck around, like our semicolons. Some of them did not stick around. I think one of my favorites is the rhetorical question mark. Somebody tried to come up with an upside down question mark, much like the one you see in Spanish, but just at the end of a sentence. And that was supposed to tell you when a question was rhetorical. Nobody's heard of the rhetorical question mark in about 3 or 4 centuries now. So
Listen, we can do this all day, right? Like this is, to me, it's beyond fascinating. But let's go to record store day. And my 3-year-old who is here with me, she's going to be coming up the steps in any minute because I think Daniel Tiger just went off. But I want to talk about record store day because there's a fight over the word vinyl. The plural of vinyl is vinyl, or is it vinyls? And I wanted to get your thoughts on this fight because we got to solve it.
You know, I think the truth is both things. The plural of vinyl can be vinyl, and it can be vinyls as well. And I say that not in the spirit of just, well, let's say everything is in and all language is equally beautiful and useful for communication purposes. That's not necessarily always true. Well, that's definitely
That's going a little
true.
too far. All right, I accept that.
Yeah. But with vinyls, I honestly cannot see a reason other than habit and nostalgia that we can't just say vinyls. And I do think that there's an interesting conversation to be had with the people who feel so passionate about the word vinyl. What's their logic for wanting to retain it? And I wonder if they really thought about that, if we would hear some incredibly interesting and compelling stories about their first time in a record store, or what it means to them to have a collection of records that a young person would walk in and say, oh, nice vinyls. And that sounds like a way to get younger people who are using the term vinyls engaged with the hobby. Rather than maybe making them feel isolated or just like, well, this person who's running this store or spending a lot of time in it doesn't have anything useful to communicate to me. Usually I find that when people are asked, why do you actually care? Why is that so important to you? Once they get past just reflexively saying, because that's the word, that's what it says on the page, let's open a dictionary, let's open a book. Usually they start to think about, okay, why is this so personally meaningful to me? And that's where you get interesting conversations. So,
I love where you're taking that though, right? Because if you feel passionately, there's a reason for it. And
mhm.
so it could just be, listen, I was taught this way, and this is how we prove ourselves to be members of the same club, which in a lot of times language is just that say, hi, this is Mrs. Watson.
Hi.
This is Professor Watson. She's a she's she writes about language and words, and she's writing a book now about watches. Can you imagine writing a book about watches? Okay, all right. This is my daughter Giselle. Ellie, say, can you see me wave?
Hi,
Okay, well,
Giselle.
we're going to talk a little bit more and then we'll go, okay? But so I think in that context, it might be important, right? Like if I bring you to a record store and you say it wrong, it reflects poorly on me, and now we're not in the club. But if you say it
Uh-huh.
right, then that kind of puts us. But I'm with you in that if we hear the original story, what record were you buying? Where was the shop? Who owned the shop? What was your record player like? See, this is preservation of American culture, and I find this to be just insanely fascinating. Tell me, what do you think about when you think about Record Store Day? Forget the grammar dispute about vinyl. What do you think about when you think about Record Store Day?
Oh, I think of being a kid, and I think of going to a record store that was on a street called Summer Avenue in Memphis. And Summer Avenue, like its name, is very bright and sunny. And I remember being in there with my dad as a kid, probably 7 or 8, and going through records with him and buying my first ever album, which was Bruce Springsteen.
Which
Born
one?
in
Do
the
you remember which one?
USA, with him in his jeans, ripped jeans in his back pocket, and
Right?
yeah, was the album itself called Born in the USA?
I
I
think so.
remember
So
that.
here's the
I
thing.
think it was.
I'm not big on rock music, but I was around rock music fans at that point in my life. So I know that album was a cultural flashpoint, right? That was a huge deal.
Yeah, yeah, and I was a probably 7 or 8 or something like that, and just liked the song. And I remember my dad taking this big album, because they're so much bigger than what we usually find music on nowadays, which is either our phones or maybe a CD or a cassette if you're really old school, but
Right?
a record. Um, so I remember him taking this big picture because it was a political statement that Springsteen was making, dressing in that outfit with the American flag, and him pointing to it and telling me, this is how he thinks of America. This is the kind of question that he's asking about America by using this image. And so I think of records fondly in a way as having this kind of pedagogic ability built into them, just because you can hold them up and show somebody, okay, here's what the presentation of something that you might think of as just audio has to do with how you encounter the music itself and how you experiencing it. And taking it in and out of that sleeve, that's an experience in and of itself that's different from the way we play other music. So those are the kinds of memories I have. And what I think is crucial in the debate is just, it's so easy now, and I don't know what you would say the psychology comes from, if it's Twitter or just the internet in general. Definitive sound bites are what everybody seems to be shooting for. And there's so much pressure to say everything right and perfectly the first time. It's almost never the case that I see people coming into a controversial statement or something that offended them and saying, hey, why did you say that? Or what did you mean? Because when you say that this way, this is what I hear, and I'm not so sure about that. I, I think the world would be a much less stressful place if we could all make it our habit to have that be our first reaction. Let's have a conversation, not let's see who can one up each other with basically poster phrases that we're kind of slapping each other with.
I love that so much. So as opposed to coming in to say, I'm going to defend my position and prove the thing I thought to be right, I'm going to listen and learn about the distinction. And then we have an opportunity to maybe get closer to a truth that is more helpful to more people. At the very least, it's more civilized. Yo, let the debate continue is what I'm hearing, right? Like, so you just said that we're
Exactly.
a soundbite culture. And I think that given that I'm in that world, it is my natural bent to look for such a soundbite. So for me, the soundbite is let the debate rage on. Call it
Mhm.
vinyl, call it vinyls. Have the conversation about your favorite music, your favorite record. Ask Cecelia Watson about her dad and Bruce Springsteen. And let's talk about what it is about these artifacts, this culture that's worthy of preservation. I'm good with this. What have I not asked you? What did you think you should have talked about that we didn't?
Listen, I think you've got this perfectly for one thing, and that's the gift of a journalist, I think, is to be able to succinctly state something without making it shallow. I don't have that skill. That's why I have to write a whole book on a semicolon. But you have done it very nicely. Um, no, I was just really curious. So that the bits that I have read about this discussion, I did find it difficult to find anyone making any kind of statement of, okay, here's why I really want vinyl to be the plural of vinyl, and let's call this records, or albums, or any other word for this round disc. Um,
I am
and I'm curious
fortunate.
if you've seen any kind of like substantive reason.
Yes. Yeah, no, I haven't. So I'm fortunate to have a bunch of DJ friends. I'm fortunate to like be
Mm.
around people who talk like this. Truly, it is my understanding that they grew up, the tradition was that the plural of vinyl was vinyl. And that was enough, right? Like once you knew the rule, that was it. And again, I think the distinction is okay, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I think the distinction is just primarily that this is what is correct and that is incorrect. And the real trick for me there is that there can be an inconsistency because DJs are artists and they will blend and
Mm.
twist and change music in ways that traditionalists would say, well, this doesn't go with that. Yeah, no, it
Mm.
does, and it's amazing. And so it's funny to me that those would be the gatekeepers for traditional ways
Mm.
of expression about their art form. It's listen, we could do this
Huh.
all day. This is so much fun. I'm going to try to send you a link to what I post. Tell me
Right.
again what the new book is called. Does the new book have a title yet?
Well, the title that I sold it with, which will be negotiated, of course, with my editor, is Wrist Game, which is kind of a pun because people say someone who wears nice watches has good wrist game,
I like
but it
this.
is also a game to try to get any watches nowadays. So,
I cannot wait to see this. If it does anything like what Semicolon did, I'm going to be calling you back. Thank you
good.
so much for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great to
Ellie, can you
talk to
say
you.
bye-bye? Can you say bye?
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, two hands. Good.
All right, take care.
You too.